Welcome everyone to the Climate Law and Governance Day Experts Roundtable on advancing the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Today we will be talking about three important messages that we focus on in implementation, that is courage, contributions, and compliance. So today I will be one of the co-chairs. I'm Advocate Mrinalini Shinde, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Cologne in International Environmental Law. And my co-chair is Professor Dr. Veselin Popovski, who is Professor and Vice Dean of Jindal Global Law School and Executive Director of the Center for Study of the United Nations. Our opening will be by Professor Marie-Claire Cordonnier-Seger, who's the Executive Secretary of the CLGI and is Leverhulme Trust Visiting Professor at the University of Cambridge. Our speakers and discussants today include Professor Michael Mehling. Unfortunately, couldn't be here as a speaker, but he will be participating. He assured us as a member of the audience, so he's with us today. There's also Professor Pilar Moraga, who should be joining as well electronically, who's the director at the Center for Environmental Law and professor at the University of Chile. We have today with us Professor Barbara Janus-Pauletta, who is the UNESCO chair and vice rector of the Kazakh German University, Dr. Cosmin Karandia, who's professor at Jindal Global Law School, Advocate Maya Grof, Esquire, who is an international lawyer and convener of the Climate Governance Commission. We have Dr. Arnab Bose, who is associate professor at Jindal Global Law School. We have Raul Salas Reyes, who is a doctoral candidate at the University of Toronto. And we have closing by an excellent speech by Dr. Maria Ivanova, who is director and professor at the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern University. So I will hand over the mic to Dr. Popovski, and he will guide you about the vision for this session and what you can hope to take away from it.
Thank you, everyone, for joining this session. As Mrinalini said, we will focus on the courage, the ambitions, and the compliance with the implementation of the Paris Agreement on climate change, with kind of a focus on innovation and what has happened so far, but also what needs to change as to add that missing ambition. I'm happy to hear about the model, whether it's working or not, and what needs to be fixed, but also some more innovative ideas, if you have such, to encourage both the public sector and the private sector to contribute more. I would like to hear also about the idea of having more sectoral approach, what they call, in a way, instead of just waiting governments to make commitments and to report to their commitments, to have professional associations, for example, one dealing with the coal mining, the biggest emitters, the other dealing with the renewable energies, another professional community dealing with agriculture and reducing emissions from animal farming, and so on. So somehow the sector itself, including public and private components in that sector, to create a community which itself can also, in addition to governments, help in crafting ideas, solutions, even making its own measurement and its own commitment. I guess that there needs to be an innovation, because what we have seen since 2015 is that the process is very slow. What, again, we call that soft law. The agreement is there, but the governments can find excuses and avoid not all of them. Of course, there are governments that are taking it very seriously, but if a government is not serious and would like to avoid the process, the commitments, the transparency, the compliance, the facilitation, and everything else, there are ways to do that. Moreover, we live in a difficult geopolitical situations where there are a lot of other issues apart from climate change to be dealt with. Some considered to be very urgent, and they are urgent, such as COVID-19, such as the war in Ukraine, and so forth and so forth. So somehow expecting only governments to deliver within the UNFCCC and the COPs and the Paris Agreement would not be sufficient, and that's kind of at least what I feel from the spirits of the discussion over the last week, but also previously. So that's my kind of initial invitation to all of you to focus on issues such as courage, ambition, and compliance, and let us know what you think. How do you consider the latest developments within the climate change law and governance? Thank you. Mrinalini, you can now give the floor to everyone. I'm here and I will comment if I find any need for that.
Thank you, Dr. Popovski. So today's session, we would like to start with first initial interventions by all speakers to set sort of the case for their research and their findings, especially as Dr. Popovski said, focusing on innovation in climate law and governance. And they all have sectoral expertise working on different aspects of law and innovation. And we're very happy to have all of them here today and their time. So the first speech now would be by Professor Marie-Claire Cordonnier-Seger as an opening to the thinking behind this session and behind the book.
Thank you very much, Mrinalini. And if you can screen share the outline of the book, just the table of contents, I always find that to explain the ideas behind an academic endeavor of that magnitude, it is easiest to do it in the way that it is eventually used, where the actual thinking behind it is available. So this book was conceived here in Climate Law and Governance Day a few years ago, actually now, in Katowice. And it is looking at the evolution of the Paris Agreement, roundtables and discussions that eventually became the treaty, that borrowed from the Montreal Protocol, that borrowed from the lessons learned in different regimes, that took into account the reports we were receiving on the science and on the law nationally and internationally. And what we are looking to do with the book in particular, as it is for Routledge, as the research handbook in this field, is to try to document not just the past, but especially what we hope for the future. Because our understanding is that if we do not succeed in our task, we won't need any more books, will we? So we're looking at the challenge of global climate change and sustainable development. And we have 3 chapters, one on the global response to climate change and its urgency, one on the need for courage, the need for nationally determined contributions to be courageous, and the need for compliance and implementation that takes into account the sustainable development goals. If you can stay up where I'm at, that would be super, instead of scrolling down too far. So just scroll back up if you can. And the third section of the book is actually looking in particular, the part 1, if you can scroll back up, is looking in particular at how the UNFCCC itself, the Paris Agreement, and legal obligations on climate change have evolved. And this is what Christina, myself, and Mrinalini are working on. The second part looks at courage in advancing international law on climate change for sustainable development. And in particular, it looks not only at the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, but also at the links to trade investment accords, to ecosystem-based solutions, to human rights law, and treaties like SCATU and ARHUS in terms of access to information and public participation, as well as some of the work, which again is serving as a research handbook, if we can scroll down just a little, looks at the nationally determined contributions and the national law, going through different regions and key countries where the challenges are most acute. Barbara is going to speak more about her chapter on Central Asia. But Margarita is also contributing on Latin America energy transitions. Vicente is also contributing on the experiences in Spain, which are truly mind-blowing, not just in terms of their environmental changes, but also in terms of the economic changes and the challenges in international investment law to the government when they tried to withdraw solar subsidies. The professors Agnieszka and Tomas and Magdalena have looked at labor law and clean energy transitions. And the chapter from Eric Kasongo Kalonji is looking in particular at the DRC and RED Plus Francophone African countries implementation. You can scroll down just a little bit more. And Freedom Kai and Alexandra have already handed in their chapter on climate action through oceans and marine resources stewardship in small island states. And then in Morocco, Jordan, and Tunisia, we have some analysis of the implementation of NDCs, particularly on adaptation, with some very, very serious stories that are being shared. Hassan, Afef, and Abdel Nasser are contributing on resilience in Ukraine with a report that they did just before the bombs began to fall. And Hafiz and Pamela are looking at, in particular, loss and damage, comparing the situation in Zambia with Bangladesh. Finally, we have a chapter that is looking at the Arctic and the Caribbean, comparing legal instruments at the regional level for resilience. The second to last section is on compliance and implementation and international legal innovations. Christina is going to be writing about their work to operationalize the PAICC. Christopher is looking as well, together with Raul Salas Reyes, at the transparency framework. Michael Mailing, who joined us this morning, has got an amazing chapter on the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement from the inside of those discussions, which were very difficult. And Jelly Molino is looking in particular at energy efficient low carbon procurement as a tool for implementation. Wendy is looking together with Douglas Lees from the Green Climate Fund at international finance and net zero implementation and how to incentivize it. And Veselina is contributing on corporate governance in the climate regime. And then I've also got something looking specifically at disclosure of climate-related financial risks. The final section, it lays out some future directions. There's something on carbon neutrality pledges for sustainable development outcomes, if you can scroll a little bit more. There's also a piece that looks at decolonizing international law, which Mrinalini is working on, and it looks to be a leading piece of scholarship in the research for today. We have Rosa commenting on international tribunals and their role in achieving increased ambition, and also Francesco and Kate and Amelia, who have written about litigation aspects of NDCs. Sumudu and Anushe have looked especially at prioritizing gender in climate action. And Cosmin, who is here with us, together with Dr. Chaya Bhardwaj, on human mobility, on climate change and beyond. Finally, we conclude with a chapter on advancing the legal research and practice agenda for climate law and governance. So it's an ambitious project. About half of the chapters are in and the other half are still on their way. And we're very much looking forward to sharing what has been done and also hearing from other experts from around the world who might have comments, ideas, or thoughts in this area before I know we have an incredibly exciting and inspiring closing speaker who's joining us today. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Cordonia Sega. If anyone is interested in knowing more about the book and the research we're doing, especially in the audience, please feel free to reach out to the CISDL Secretariat. We're very happy to continue this conversation about the upcoming book. And next, after this opening, we will start on the initial interventions. And the way this session was constructed is that we have experts who are all working on different aspects of courage, contributions, and compliance with the Paris Agreement. So our first speaker to start the discussion would be Professor Barbara Janus Pauletta. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted because this project is already for quite some time a platform for very much interdisciplinary legal exchange. I think that's indeed the approach of the climate law to look at the very different aspects, sectors of sectoral regulation. When we look at the climate mitigation and when we look at the climate adaptation legal efforts, I think that's exactly where we can have a very fruitful discussion. So in my paper, I'm contributing more from the climate adaptation perspective. I'm looking at the water resources, which, I mean, especially here in Central Asia, it's of a very critical, where I'm based already for a couple of years. That's a very critical issue. When we look at the, maybe just to explain the context and the climate mitigation, we have more on the national level of regulation. We have the need for low carbon urban water supply, and especially for wastewater management, which should be less CO2 intensive, so to say, and also the recent movements worldwide towards the hydropower use and hydrogen. This is one of the ways how water can support to a little bit remove aside maybe the heavy energy sources. And this is on the mitigation side, because usually water is kind of considered as an adaptation effort, adaptation to the climate change. So I think that both issues are very important. And obviously on the adaptation side, we look at the basin management perspective according to international water law, and trying to see how to use the existing principles and mechanisms of the international water law to achieve this, you would say, new goal, but it's not really new goal. It should not be the new goal for international water law, because climate was always there. Absolutely, now it's more getting more urgent and finally getting sufficient attention. Because even here, like in Central Asia, I'm just looking through my window and I see 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 high mountains covered by glaciers. But we know that probably by 2050. Even worldwide, half of the glaciers which are covered by now as a heritage announced by UNESCO, they might disappear. And this is the same case here. And then respectively, we are going to certainly have less water. And again, to tackle the issue of water management in terms of the climate, which so heavily impacts this area, it's very important to say that the main so to say instrument in play is international law, because as water are mainly transboundary worldwide, also the climate issue is transboundary. So I think that the complex of the International Framework Convention for Climate Change, the operational agreements like the Paris Agreement, but also other environmental related, multilateral environmental agreements related to biodiversity, to Ramsar Convention related to wetlands, and others like ESPO Convention or Aarhus Convention. Any of them, they play like a set of, they offer us a set of the different instruments which are indispensable for solving this climate challenge, which we have certainly here in this region, which is a red spot on the climate map worldwide, but I think also worldwide wherever else. So indeed, we have, I'm discussing in my chapter the different principles and mechanisms. I mean, the main principles, which I call the equitable and reasonable use of water resources, the principle of no significant harm to the neighboring upper, usually downstream country, principle of the cooperation among the countries, which are very specific for international water law. At the same time, it is operationalized on in the procedural law by the obligation to information exchange, to notification among the countries, to coordination in the form of joint bodies, usually, or in best case, on the transboundary basin level. And finally, I'm discussing the different so to say these different principles and their implementations. And I think that it is also to conclude, because I don't know how much time, I'm the first speaker, this is, the most tempting to take all over the time, but just to limit myself, it is just also very much to say that this research is very interdisciplinary in the sense of water law. And we are still a little bit discussing, because indeed I'm based here in Central Asia, so that's the very natural focus. But since I have a very respectful co-author, Alexandra Harrington, she's more looking towards European regulations. So we are kind of trying to balance and exchange on this experience in the upcoming book chapter. Yes, so probably if there is a need, we can go into the more detailed discussion in terms of the questions. But I really would like to stress that for me, it was an experience, I mean, coming from the field of water law, okay, environmental law, just to look at this, what I know from this urgent new perspective, and to try to advise or to teach the students under the new angle, if you want to see the similar approaches, but under very new angles. That's why I started to learn very strongly how much we need in the interpretation of law the flexibility, because setting up a new rules would be difficult in international water law. It took, I don't know, almost 60 years probably to arrive at the final regulatory document. So I don't think that it's going to change quicker than it has been established. So we have to be very kind of flexible in interpretation of the water law, be it on the international level in transboundary basins or also on national level. Yes, having said that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor János Pauleta. Before we move to the next speaker, I want to quickly take a moment to recognize Professor Rosa Fernandez-Aguirre, who is with us today. She is also one of the co-authors in the book on on international tribunals and climate change law, and she has co-authored her chapter already with Pau de Vilches Moraes. And it's wonderful to have you here, Professor Fernandez-Aguirre, and please feel free to present after Professor Barbara Pauleta, if you want to just share a quick couple of sentences about your chapter. I know that you're busy today.
Oh, thank you, Mrinalini. I'm not sure you can see me. I don't know what it's. Yeah.
No, your video is off, but we can hear you clearly.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. Just wanted to say that I'm writing this chapter together with Professor Pau de Vilches, and we are trying to talk about the contribution that international courts may have, as we believe they can play a special and very important role in fighting climate change in general, and also in advancing the application of the Paris Agreement in particular. And what we try is to prove that their rulings and opinions can serve as a catalyst to promote climate change mitigation and adaptation policies and regulations, as well as to provide remedies for loss and damages. And as we go through the jurisprudence and case law of the most important ones, such as the International Court of Justice or the European Court of Human Rights, together with the European or the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. We also going to talk about the WTO dispute settlement and a little bit of the International Tribunal of the Law of the Seas. We just want to explore the potential that all of these courts, but also other organs, they're not court as such, but they have a very important role nowadays, especially after some of the cases that they are deciding. and I'm talking about the UN organisms on human rights. And you just want to go over all these past case law that all these tribunals and international courts have done in the past in order to prove that they can have a big role in helping to implement the Paris Agreement, and especially maybe the International Court of Justice with its important role of clarifying the existence and nature of some of the environmental customary norms. So that's more or less what I wanted to say, and I hope you will find this chapter interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. I also want to take this moment to recognize Professor Rosa Fernandez-Eguía, because she was the one who hosted Climate Law and Governance Day in Madrid in 2019, and at very short notice, because as you know, the COP was shifted from Chile to Madrid with 2 weeks notice, and it was a wonderful day, and it was extremely important for us to come together during that CLGD and to work further on this book. So she's instrumental to our efforts. So thank you very much for that as well, Professor. Our next speaker will be Dr. Cosmin Coendia, and he is the perfect bridge between not only this book, but also the work being done at the Jindal Global Law School, as he is a professor there as well. And we're really looking forward to his views, as his work in the book specifically focuses on human mobility. So the floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much, Mrinalini, and I'm very, very happy to be here for the 7th year in a row. I'm very happy to be part of this family, wonderful family and wonderful growing family. It's always a pleasure and it's always a privilege for me to share my knowledge, to share my research, and hopefully that through the book we're gonna become more available for all the people, especially the governments, because here we're already talking about the sectorial approach. Well, the book chapter we wrote 2 years back already, it's actually focusing on the implementation of Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, on the objective of the Paris Agreement, under which all countries and governments have an international obligation to protect and to implement the Paris Agreement. While this is happening, we are promoting all the governments, and this is maybe can be interpreted as a sectorial approach. We are promoting each and every government to have preemptive measures and to create preemptive policies in relation to human mobility, in particular human mobility and climate change. I think it's useless to say in such an area full of experts that the people who are being displaced due to disasters reach 250 million, and the projections of 750 million is not encouraging whatsoever. So in this regard, in the last 2 years, we actually struggled to convince the governments, and we're running after the governments to convince them to implement some kind of human mobility note in the NDC's submissions and eventually NAPs. Because we believe that once they have it mentioned in the NDC submissions, this is their mandate, the mandate they need in order to start creating preemptive policies. Policies in regards to the displacement, policy in regards to plan relocation, and even policies regarding to trust funds and all the financial mechanisms which can be available in these kind of situations. We are facing quite a reluctance coming from the governments, and not mainly because of the new attributions, of the new obligations which are being created, but of the lack of knowledge, of this nexus between human mobility, climate change, using obviously human rights-based approach, which is so much necessary. And because of that lack of knowledge, and this is where we have to, in my opinion, we have to push more, is that they do not understand the connection. They don't understand that people are being displaced due to climate change and disasters. And on the same time, even more complicatedly, they do not understand that displacement itself, that forced migration, that all these 250 million people can actually contribute to accelerating climate change triggers. And so it's a two-way street, which they are not very familiar with. But however, we've been successful in convincing some departments who are in charge with the NDCs in some African countries. The Pacific countries are doing well in this regards. They all have the mandate. Now all they need is a little bit of political will and eventually some financial support as always. And also in Asia, we're facing quite openness in regards to implementing this nexus of human mobility and climate change. This being said, it was a long way. It is a very long road we have to follow. It is not easy. However, I strongly believe that the governments should finally understand that preemptive measures taken in this regard are much better than humanitarian crisis. We're already facing a climate change crisis, and I believe this is enough for everyone. So I don't believe on top of that, having a humanitarian crisis created by a flux of irregulated migrants who, by the way, did not want to leave their homes, so forced migrants, I don't believe it's necessary. So in this regard, we are pushing for the policies to be created. Unfortunately, the policies cannot be created by the civil society, cannot be created by communities. And here where the governments have to step in and somehow, based on the indigenous knowledge they receive, based on the understanding of this knowledge, of this nexus between human mobility and climate change, to somehow start addressing that. This is in a nutshell the chapter we been writing for the last couple of years. This is in a nutshell our work at Jindal Law School in order to promote and put research into practice, to start and develop policies, and more complicatedly to implement policies. I'm very happy, and this is my conclusion. I'm very happy to report that Fiji finalized the standard operation procedures for plan relocation guidelines after 2 long years. And finally, Fiji becomes the first country in the world which has a full package of human mobility in the context of climate change and disasters policies which are ready to be implemented on the ground. We used good lessons. Well, we were based on the plan relocation guidelines for 2018. And I strongly believe, as being already recognized by some presidents from the Pacific countries and by other entities, that Fiji, it's a good example to follow. So following that, I hope in good news, the expectations are moderate here in Sharm, but we are looking forward to get better. Thank you so much for allowing me, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Karandia. It's a very nice, rare change to have such positive stories and examples. So thank you so much for that, for setting our discussion on a very optimistic tone.
Let me also add my thanks for the work COSMIN is doing, and really happy to see when something can be planned ahead, as you said, the preventive approach, the long-term prevention of eventual mobility, if it is taken seriously in the beginning, can produce the kind of policies in advance so that people migrate not so because of some disaster, but rather very much being aware of opportunities. So you kind of turn the idea from forceful migration to a voluntary migration. People understand the challenges of the future, so they decide by themselves to migrate because there will be better opportunity. I like that kind of positive approach rather than negative approach to migration on climate change. And absolutely nobody better than COSMIN knows that, who for many years already help governments to undertake that approach. My appreciation.
Thank you, Dr. Popovski. So our next speaker is Advocate Maya Groff, Esquire, and we're looking forward to hearing her experiences and research, especially from the Climate Governance Commission. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Hello, everybody. And so lovely to join you. And thank you so much for bringing us all into this conversation about what looks like a really amazing book and resource for all of us. So very excited to benefit from all of this research and learning. So yes, I've been working on this Climate Governance Commission, leading it for several years now. We had a first strategy session in 2019 at the Global Green Growth Institute in Seoul. From that first strategy session, which was regionally focused and international, we led up to international consultations over the last couple of years to an interim report released in advance of COP26. So the Commission is really taking a global governance lens, but then, looking at the layers of governance, that the global is not antithetical to the regional, to the national, to the very local community level, but they should all be interdependent, and good global governance, of course, takes all the layers into account. And when we look at global governance, of course, the tools of international law are highly relevant. So we're looking at improvements to the Paris Agreement, UNFCCC processes, but then also other governance and legal tools beyond the Paris Agreement to support its aims. And then looking even a bit further, what is the next generation of global climate environmental governance that we might need to start looking at perhaps sooner rather than later, simply because of the gravity of the crisis that we're in. So we're now moving into a new high-level phase of the Commission. Former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson, current chair of the Elders, has agreed to be one of our high-level commissioners, really ambassadors for the work of the Commission. And we plan to release a short, hopefully shorter, not an academic study or tome, but really a pithy, we hope, report in advance of COP28 to put together really what we see as high impact key global governance proposals, again, taking this near a longer term approach. And we also really hope to include, benefiting from the Elders' mission and vision, some fundamental insights and wisdom on the topic of governance at this crucial time in human history, where we're told by scientists that this may be the most important decade in human history, and this is no understatement. So we really have to think deeply about what we need to do. So just to give you a bit of an idea of some of the proposals we included in our interim report. And what we try to do in this interim report is really to build very diverse and vibrant communities of practice. So we included proposals from ongoing campaigns, including youth campaigns, other campaigns of professionals. We are working with really engaged policy institutes in various countries that are influencing on the ground national policy and international climate and environmental policy. As well as academics and academic institutions. So really a community that should be powerful in trying to bring together the most high impact, promising proposals, and then pushing them forward is also what we hope to support. So a few of the, just to give you a sample of some of the proposals, we had a former UNFCCC senior official write a proposal for an international policy clearinghouse or hub, potentially a more dynamic hub where nations and other jurisdictions, cities around the world can share in an accelerated fashion key policies that are relevant to mitigation, adaptation. I mean, this example of Fiji is incredible. Now, how do we scale and disseminate such leading policies around the world? And for example, another sort of national policy or governance innovation or progressive step forward that we studied are comparative national climate policy councils, science-based, science-informed, to connect national governance with the international obligations and the international scientific work. And how do we, again, help to support the whole international community to scale up these governance improvements at the national level, where we've recently been in touch with the Ministry of the Environment in New Zealand. They have a chief executives board with the ministers from all relevant agencies who are working together, informed by their climate, National Climate Policy Council, and reporting directly to the Prime Minister to achieve their climate goals. So again, we don't have time to reinvent the wheel. We need to be learning from each other really on the ground. We're also looking at corporate governance. How do we scale up the B Corp and benefit corporation legislation movement, which again, it has not been systematized yet. There's good ongoing research, which is quite new, again, about comparative benefit corporation legislation, where corporations, in their actual legal documents are mandated to serve the common good, including the environment. So these are sort of, how do we get the best policies really scaled up at the international level? We were also looking at proposals for various international cooperation agreements for intensified international cooperation for the global energy transition. Also, these agreements could be rebalancing to a global south perspective. We have a proposal for a global green hydrogen alliance, distributed renewable energy alliance, a finance risk mitigation mechanism to get more finance flows to the global south. Trade policy, of course, is potentially a powerful lever for climate change. We've looked that area, and also some pretty profound issues that are adjacent to the climate challenge, including proposals for a new international anti-corruption court. If we look at the international finance situation, it's estimated, several trillion a year may be lost to corruption at the global level. So we think all of these types of proposals need to be looked at alongside longer term, more ambitious proposals like a global environment agency, a world environment organization that scientists have been saying are necessary for many years, but has been sort of very, very much eschewed at the international diplomatic level. So I'll sort of, in the interest of time, I won't go into some further proposals we're currently exploring. We're working with a network of lawyers and scientists working on Earth systems governance law, really a paradigm shift within international environmental law to take account of the latest science and the new Anthropocene reality that we're living in. Also looking at, international security paradigms, again, given the Anthropocene and the nature of our global planetary climate emergency, based on the latest science, what should we be doing as an international community in terms of our highest APEC security organization, the UN Security Council, or other bodies that need to be established to really take into account and coordinate a genuine sort of more emergency response at the international level. And I'll just end with a few sort of sociological observations. I'm primarily a practitioner working in the development and servicing of international multilateral binding treaties, as well as soft law supports to these binding treaties for many years. And what we've seen in the international legal field is really incredible steps forward in the international legal architecture that are spearheaded by so-called smart coalitions of global civil society actors with like-minded states. And often laypersons lead these movements. So I think this is for us practicing international lawyers, we have to take this seriously and think about how some of these approaches and techniques can be applied in the international climate and governance field to try to advance some new global governance innovations that are badly needed. So we're, for example, having a strategy session tomorrow here at COP with progressive policy makers and think tanks, also civil society actors, experts, to see, explore what a smart coalition would look like in this area of global enhanced climate and environmental governance, and what the key proposals to advocate for would look like. And I would say also, even what the sort of Overton window now in terms of the global governance is different, even from 2015 and the landscape negotiating the Paris Agreement. We know that the science is even more clear. Of course, we know that the effects are happening even more quickly, are more grave than the scientific models have been predicting. So, this is also we're thinking a way to how do we more powerfully support the goals of the Paris Agreement using the various tools of international law, global governance, and to start thinking, more courageously and boldly in this way, because there may be some more ambitious, genuine opportunities at the moment. So I'm probably over my time, so I'll stop there, but look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Maya. Well, again, admiration for all the work you have done. I remember that meeting 3 years ago in Seoul, in Korea, where the Climate Governance Commission was discussed as a very much abstract idea, but really it is a long road. So for 3 years, you have done more than, to be honest, I was a bit skeptical at the time, why do we need yet another body within already many existing bodies in that field of climate change and policy, but obviously you prove within the commission that you really channel what was missing exactly, the possible innovative policies that can be adopted and that can make that difference, which was missing before that. And obviously all your work you mentioned in terms of the anti-corruption court and supporting so many proposals is exactly the way forward as to kind of bridge that gap, which we already identified, the gap between promises and delivery. I think your commission has done absolutely admirable work. Thank you. Who is next? Mrinalini will introduce.
Popovski. I just want to give a reminder to everyone in the audience that do use the chat function, not the chat function, the question answer function of your Zoom display to ask questions to the panel. And all panelists have the choice to either wait till we go into answering questions live, or if there are technical questions, especially feel free to answer them in the chat already. So our next speaker is Dr. Arnab Bose, also from the Jindal Global Law School, and the floor is yours.
Greetings, everyone. And it is lovely to speak to so many people. And Professor Popovski and I, we have worked on very important issues. In fact, there's a paper published earlier in his book where I talked about the disconnects of local realities with global ambition. And this was a case study in India. Now, I, of course, now speak as a finance professional. Just before this university, I worked in a bank. And before that, I've worked in the Energy and Resources Institute, so where we were structuring various things. Now, I want to speak as a finance professional and some of the ground realities, which I saw, especially from the contracts perspective. Now, we know energy transitions and financial innovations have been hand in hand for a very long time. So for people who have studied James Watt's steam engine, know that it had come in the time of the intellectual property regime. But very few people know how that particular law translated into structuring a debt arrangement, okay, and how that manifested in the world's first steam engine being scaled to proportion. In general, the climate finance thing is discussed on currently. How do we get long-term stable financial flows? Okay. Now, before we get into that, there are a few things, few unique challenges, which I think this body can kind of understand. Professor Maya had talked about finance and risk. I'll give some of the implementation risks, which I, as a finance professional, like a modeler putting in data in an Excel sheet, had found. When I was working on my first cases, it was with a European bank. And I found out a very strange thing as a part of the Kyoto Protocol. And I was looking into CDM, Clean Development Mechanism. So there will be transfer of money from Europe to India if India was doing certain renewable energy projects. In India, renewable energy projects normally will get a clearance if the return on project is 15%. But I got a call from my higher up saying that, look, if you have to financially model this, if you want CDM money, Clean Development Mechanism money, you have to figure out a project which is less than 10% return on investment. So the incentive schemes were very lopsided. Here, I was trying to figure out the best renewable projects which will give me over 15% return on the investment which investors are making. Now, if I want CDM money, I have to go on a different tangent and see things which were not working. This was a structural problem which had to do with the CDM. I'll give you another one which I had come across. For example, decentralized electricity solutions using renewable energy. Okay, Terry had a very brilliant program called Light a Billion Lives. If people know, circa 2010. This was a fantastic thing. When people in Bangladesh, India, Tanzania, they were looking at this particular program, they were looking at it as a climate adaptation measure. Very interesting. So the grassroots researchers were thinking of this as a climate adaptation. So they were structuring their proposals for climate adaptation fund. But when it reached Europe for funding, they, as soon as they saw renewable energy, they thought this is climate mitigation. Okay, so these were the kind of ontological problems structuring the contracts, which I thought that this will become a very good paper. In fact, in later times. Finally, what I would like to say over here is that if we want to, if keeping to the theme of today's thing, there is a particular financial mechanism called financial gradients, which divides, and this is particularly good for structuring, the legal structuring of, say, things like the Green Climate Fund, or any climate fund for that matter, is to structure it onto grants and investment grade. Grants, essentially, which I've seen from Terry, there are two kinds of grants: research grants and pure grants, which are philanthropic grants. And in terms of investment grade money, there are two kinds of things. There's debt and there is equity. Now, what will happen is, the courage is, for a finance professional, is commit to the financial allocation, commit to it. And the contribution is, initially, all these commitments will be grants. They will be possibly grants. But the compliance, a very easy, cost-effective compliance mechanism is to see if the size of the financial allocation is increasing over time and the grants are becoming investment grade. In fact, in Terry, they did the study. I was a part of it.
Thank you, Dr. Bose. Sorry, do you have a question for the speakers? Because we have been joined by an extra host of Climate Law and Governance Day, who is just waiting to be introduced, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mrinalini,
Professor Magdalena Estrella is here with us. She's a former host from Katowice of the Climate Law and Governance Day, and she's been able to join us as well for the discussion. And so welcome, Magdalena, to the discussion. And since we are now in the discussion part of the session, I would also like to invite Raul Salas to act as discussant and to put forward a couple of important questions, especially for our panel to think about as we transition into our discussion session before the closing by Professor Ivanova. Yeah.
Hello. Hello, everyone.
Hello, Magdalena, we can hear you.
Yes, you can hear me. Hello. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. And it's an honor for me to be here. We just closed our panel number 7 about the war in Ukraine. And it's really delighted that next, another year, we could join you and that you accepted our panel, and it was really fantastic time. And I know that this panel is about the book that we are also very, very exciting. The co-author of our book is Professor Tomasz Pietrzykowski and Professor Agnieszka Bielska-Brodziak. So today I represent 3 of us, and our chapter will be about the just transition, and in the light of Silesia, in the light of Poland and Polish perspective, because as we know, the just transition was established in 2018, but the concept is not new. So our chapter will describe what is behind the concept of just transition. That just transition involves the implementation of policies aiming to create a fair and prosperous future for workers and communities as the work builds a low carbon economy. The just transition also is a concept about to involve relevant stakeholders, giving them the right to be heard at the stage of planning, implementing, and evaluation transformation process. We also want to show how the just transition has evolved from a political slogan within 1980s American trade union movement to a legal one over the past decades, then through Paris agreements, of course, through Katowice rulebook, and through European Green Deal, and then through, for example, central concept of EU regulation 2021/1056. And we want to show that just transition has developed dramatically from a political slogan through soft international law, finally to a legal regulation which affects 500 million EU citizens. And we also want to share with you in this chapter about case of Poland, because it's interesting that Poland is not new to big transformation, having the transitions to a market economy during the 1990s. But that transformation may have been quite different in nature. It was a completely political system redesign and economic recovery after decades of communism. And what is important that that transformation was this time provide a lesson of the risk associated with, we call this shock therapy, without any focus on the social outcomes associated. The actual economic transformation was successful, but the social impact were catastrophic for some. So these effects remains to this day, and we want to express this in our chapter. And what is most important for us is show you that and that's not you, but we want to express this in our chapter, that without Poland is very crucial and very important actor on the stage on all climate activities. And we want to show how Poland was dealing on the stage of climate activities and protect climate. For example, we have the report from own Supreme Audit Office on the years 2017 to 2020, and for example, the report was highly critical of Polish climate change policy and decision in these years. The Ministry of Climate, Environment, and National Energy Office are designed to bring about progress, but instead the report found that they had increased the barriers to taking proper action. And in these years, the report found that the lack of long-term strategy, legal instrument, and consistent implementation was greatly slowing down the transformation process. As a result, key renewable sectors have almost stopped developing. So this is these are the aspects that we wanna show in our chapter. And what is important, that without successful of Polish climate policy in Poland, there is no chance that European climate policy has chance to success, because we are very problematic key area. So thank you so much that I could share with you some thoughts about our chapter, and thank you, Marie-Claire, for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Magdalena. I appreciate it. Now, I want to thank you also for hosting CLGD in Katowice during COP24. So now I will go to Raul, who will quickly add his intervention, especially directing to all speakers as well, which will be then followed by the closing by Dr. Ivanova. In the meantime, please do feel free to answer the questions in the chat. And I encourage all audience members to put your questions in the chat so we can continue the discussion both live and in the chat as well. Thank you so much.
Well, hopefully you can hear me well. The internet, I'm at the COP and the internet's a little bit choppy where I am. But thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be talking about the chapter that my colleague, Professor Christopher Campbell Durflay, and I have been working on for the last couple of years for this much needed book. And I speak as a transparency expert and as a researcher in climate governance. So in this chapter, we see an additional avenue for Article 13 to pave the way for what we see as a transparency that is transformative. So most of the potential that is hidden in provisions in Article 13, they're embedded in provisions that contain should, may, and encouragement language. So this is going beyond the focus of reporting for the sake of reporting, and actually we see an opportunity to push for Article 13 for its highest possible ambition that can be transformative. Now, in this chapter, we look at 3 challenges and 3 responses that can enable Article 13 of the Paris Agreement. So in one, we see the risk that parties fail to take the particular vulnerability and the respective capabilities, but also the national circumstances of certain groups into consideration as parties enhance their reporting on mitigation to understand the implementation and achievement of their NDCs. Now, the second is the risk that parties reporting on the climate finance provided failed to allow meaningful comparisons between individual countries' levels of support. So the idea of this is to discuss how to assist in closing that finance gap, which is one of the most hot topics here at COP27 in Sharm El Sheikh. And the third one, we look at the risk that parties' enhanced reporting on adaptation failed to improve their capacity to avoid conflicts between adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development. So we provide responses to these 3 challenges, and we identify diverse transformative approaches to transparency. And really the idea is we want to present concrete proposals that can enable Article 13 to go beyond just, as I mentioned, just looking for transparency, but something that can do more. Now, for example, I can focus on just one opportunity that the Enhanced Transparency Framework presents and that can enable parties. And I say this with certain caution, as I mentioned, because there are obviously certain concerns raised that transparency, that when it's only focused on reporting, you lose those learning opportunities and you don't see what the information is telling you. But if we actually look for a more transformative approach, then it could lead to more ambitious and transformative avenues. So the question here is, how can the ETF enable such learning opportunities, for example? And one of them is focusing on, as I mentioned, those provisions that have main encouragement language. And one of them are 2, which are very interesting. For example, is reporting on non-GHG mitigation benefits, which uses a May language, and to report the social impact of response measures, which is only encouraged in Article 13 and the MPGs. So by knowing non-GHG mitigation benefits and the social impacts requires institutional public frameworks, they're likely to go just beyond the reporting practices. In Uruguay, for example, is a country that has promoted gender equality through mitigation actions. And they have enabled arrangements to work with other institutions, with statistical institutions to do so this type of change. So in this case, the reporting mitigation actions can render the social impacts. Okay, so I will leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. So once again, I would like to remind everyone, do put your questions in the chat because all the panelists can look at them and answer them. So I encourage the audience to ask your questions in the chat. And now we move to our last talk for today, and that's the closing speech by Dr. Ivanova. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure listening to everyone today around these very inspiring topics of courage, contribution, and compliance. And I'm going to reflect some things that what I have heard today and inject some of the work that I am doing at Northeastern University in Boston that might be of use to take this transformation train forward. So, courage. We have to be bold, right? And today I'm hearing from the panelists that we have to have courage to put on new issues on the agenda. We have to have the courage to create new institutions, and we have to have the courage and the ability to create new coalitions and communities. So on new issues, yes, there are a number of issues that have come up in the climate arena, and I would like to point out that countries are also putting new issues that are related, but might be seen as beyond. An example is the new plastics treaty that Rwanda and Peru are championing, and the negotiations, the first INC or INC, in Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, is taking place in Uruguay in Punta del Este at the end of the month. So we are looking toward a new plastics agreement. It was discussed before that the climate agreement looked to Montreal, the Paris agreement looked to Montreal, looked to other issues. What can we learn from climate for plastics? And the importance of small states like Rwanda and Peru of leading, being courageous leaders for creating a new global plastics treaty. Then in new institutions, we heard the anti-corruption court. Absolutely, there's a need for a new institution, but will that require courage? Oh yes, significant. That's one of the main issues that prevent effective implementation of any law, not just climate, not just environment, but the corruption issue is very difficult to tackle. It requires a lot of courage and a lot of support, and indeed a lot of transparency. The more transparency there is, the less the risk of someone being singled out and brought down. And so yes, we need new institutions, but they're not always the best response. I'm going to argue here against creating a World Environment Organization that I have written about multiple times, including in my book about the UN Environment Program, which I argue was created with a very bold vision, with an ambitious mandate that is still valid. And what we need to do is enable that organization to work effectively, and creating one organization for all environment, in my analysis, will not solve the environmental problems. The environmental problems are so many that creating one big organization is just, it's not feasible. It's not necessary. Enabling the existing ones to work would be a much better trajectory. And the book is open access by MIT Press, and I gave the link to Mrinalini, and you can share with the participants. So I will differ with some of the panelists' statements here based on my own research about global environmental governance. But then on new coalitions and communities, it's really amazing to see the vibrancy of discussion here and ideas. And yes, new communities by sector, absolutely. But the sectors shift. How can we create these mosaics of different sectors? And what I heard is a very positive movement here, and indeed with the global climate, or the Climate Governance Commission, the engagement of academia in a more sustainable, systematic, and truly genuine manner. How can academics be engaged, not just as saying what is, but responding to policymakers and their questions of what should be done? And this is now becoming a driver for more and more universities. Northeastern University, where I am based, has a very explicit mission that is think and do. We can't just think. We have to think and do. We have to have grounding in the real world and impact on the real world. And so I see in terms of contribution, there's leadership on the current commitments, and the strategy that Christina Figueres has proclaimed a number of times: don't name and shame, name and acclaim. This is really important. And this is where environmental institutions have to step up and see which countries are actually delivering, in what ways, in which part of their commitments. This is something that our team is also working on. We have developed an environmental conventions index that measures the extent to which countries are actually delivering on the promises. That gap between promises and delivery, it's across all of the conventions. And we have developed an index I gave Mrinalini also the open access to the article that shares that index. And we currently are in collaboration with UNEP, with the UN Environment Program, are offering these courses to government officials. And they're seeing, oh, we're actually doing better than we expected. And then naming and acclaiming governments as South Africa or Rwanda or the Philippines. I will finish up.
Thank
now,
you so
Marina.
much, Dr. Ivanova. The
Just
Zoom
one
will-
last thing.
The Zoom
One
will be
last
shutting
thing.
down now at 13:30. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
And-
No, tell us the last thing, Maria. Don't
Yeah.
worry. Tell us the
My
last
last thing is what I heard from this panel is that we need radical transparency for radical transformation.
thing. Thank you.
Thank
Very
you so
well
much.
said.